My name is Hayley Denbraver, and this talk is about developing a security mindset. And I hope to give you some practical advice for all Pythonistas. Let's talk about a security mindset and what it is. And I have excellent news for everyone, and that is that you have a security mindset already. You may just not be applying it to your projects. The idea here is that there are things that I do in my daily life that help me stay personally secure, but there are also things that I can do within my projects that are just good habits, good maintenance things that will help my project be more secure. And, you know, they don't even have to be all that hard necessarily. Now, how are we going to discuss security? If you'll allow me, we're going to discuss security and security mindset with a bit of whimsy and mystery, and I hope you're all along for the ride. Now, this talk is going to feature some excellent guests, and they are some of the luminaries of English detective fiction: Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, and Miss Marple. Now, these are our Python detectives, and we're going to discuss some security concepts through the lens of what we can learn from detective fiction. And the reason to do this is just to have a little bit of fun and to inspire some curiosity. And I just really like detective fiction. So that's it. All right, so let's learn a little bit about our guests. Now, Miss Jane Marple is a bit of a busybody, and she knows a lot, maybe too much, about her neighbors. She's often underestimated, and she's always listening. She's thoroughly educated, but she's not officially trained. Excuse me. She's not officially trained, nor does she have any official credentials, that sort of thing. All right. And then Hercule Poirot. Now, he understands psychology. He believes in the predictability of human behavior. He's fastidious. He keeps his cards close. And he can spot when someone is pretending to be somebody they're not. All right. Now we have Sherlock Holmes. Now, he observes minute details. He knows that you don't necessarily need to leave your home to dig up some interesting information, which is very useful nowadays. He's a thorough researcher. He questions assumptions, and he ignores rules when they don't suit him. So each of these detectives, we're going to have several questions for them, and we're going to use those questions to introduce some security concepts and see what we can do to build our security mindset. All right, so the first question is, what do you know about your neighbors? And for this question, we're going to go to Miss Marple. She is up to date on the latest going on. She has an understanding of the general character of her neighbors, and she knows who associates with whom. She also is not hesitant to expose bad actors. And my recommended reading for this question is The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. It will give you a good idea of how she understands her neighborhood and her little village in St. Mary Mead, and how it helps her solve a mystery. All right. And so by what do you know about your neighbors in security, I really mean, do you understand the vulnerabilities in your open source dependencies? Now, you can think of the open source libraries that you use as your neighborhood. This is the very first Python project I wrote several years ago, many years ago. And this is a dependency tree from that project. The little indicator things there are showing where there are potential security issues. So this kind of gives you a map and understanding of your neighborhood. And it's important to know what you're using, right? Now, we spend a lot of time in our code writing original code, writing code for ourselves, writing code specific to our project. And because we spend so much time doing that, it can make you think that your original code takes up a larger footprint of all the code in production than it actually does. So you may think that, like, sure, I have a lot of dependencies, but I've written a lot of original code myself. And so maybe the breakdown where this circle represents all code in production, maybe the breakdown is something like this, where it's about half and half, something like that. And it's very natural to think of it this way, but you know, your mileage may vary, and depending on the project, your code in production could really look like this, but it could also look like this, or this, or this. And what's significant here is that any problems in production are problems for your project. And if you are really precise and well thought out and stuff in your original code, but you don't consider this stuff, all of your dependencies, the known vulnerabilities in them, etc., you have a fairly large footprint of code that could be problem. And it's not to say that open source is bad or that you shouldn't use these dependencies, because it's a really great tool. And you know, we're at DjangoCon. I love Django, but it's about keeping your eyes open and knowing when there are known problems, and balancing your risk and reward appropriately, and just being aware if there is an issue and if you can fix it. So you, above all, just want to know the information. And that's part of why I like using detectives, is that you're really out to have all the facts and make an appropriate decision. So anyway, let's continue. So what should you know about your neighbors? Well, you should know if any of the packages that you use have known security vulnerabilities. Additionally, you should know which packages that you use indirectly. So these are things that you are not going to pip install yourself, but they get dragged in with the dependencies that you do pip install. That makes sense. So you should know what these are, and you should know if they have any vulnerabilities. Then you can make a decision about remediation and whether you're okay with what's there. All right. So how do I keep track of all of this? And I recommend automating when you can. It can get really complicated, and you know, the dependency chart that I showed you earlier was for a very, very simple project. Something on a more enterprise scale is going to be a lot, you're going to have a lot more. So I recommend automating when you can, and I would recommend you check out potential solutions. There are open source and enterprise solutions that can help you do this. PyEnv has some security testing. Pyup.io is a Python specific thing, and Sneak.io has a free tier, and they are compatible with Python. All right. So to summarize, Understand your open source dependencies and remediate known issues. Use a tool to help you do this. There are open source options and enterprise options. All right, so let's go on to our next question for our detectives. Are people who they say they are? Now, for this one, we're going to go to Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes, and they have a lot to say on the subject. And here are the things that we might learn from detective fiction. First is, if there is an actor in the story, you should be suspicious of them. And second, we can think a little bit about how we confirm identity. Now, in detective stories, it might be something like handwriting or mannerisms or how they look. But is there something more to that? Are there other ways, right? You're going to want to consider the importance of names, nicknames, and aliases when you're reading detective fiction. And for this particular question on identity and how do you know someone is who they say they are, I have the following recommended readings. And they are Lord Edgware Dies After the Funeral by Agatha Christie. Although A Murder is Announced by Agatha Christie is another good one. And then by Arthur Conan Doyle, there is A Case of Identity and The Adventure of the Stockbroker's Clerk. And so if you're curious to read about mistaken identities, that sort of thing, those are fun books. Now, so when I ask about how do we know people are who they say they are, I want to talk a little bit about authentication and permissions. Now, let's turn to authentications first. So what should you know about authentications in Python? So first, you should know not to roll your own off. There are people who get PhDs in cryptography, and you know, if you should be using encrypted passwords, and you don't want to do that yourself. Don't roll your own encryption, your own authentication. Use the tools available. Secondly, don't store plain text passwords anywhere. Don't store them in a text file in your computer. Don't store them in your chat with yourself in your Slack channel. Don't store them on Post-it notes. Don't store them in the database for sure. Don't do it. Third, use two-factor auth on your personal accounts wherever you can, and try to offer it for your project, for your users, if it's at all possible. And then finally, with authentication, you should know that Django doesn't throttle user authentications by default. So you should use a complementary tool to do so someone can't brute force try to log in a ton of times. So something like Django Defender is useful in that case. All right. So what should I know about permissions? And for permissions, that's basically where you have a user, and the user should be allowed to do the things that you want to allow them, but they should not be able to do things outside of that limited scope. And you need to be thoughtful about what permissions you need and how to apply them. And I would say first that you'll want to be as granular as possible. Granular is practical. It's always easier and safer to grant an additional permission than it is to try to revoke one. So if you have a user that finds that they can't do something they should be able to do, it's easier to grant them that permission than to that's a better error than it is to grant someone more permissions than they should really have. That makes sense. And finally, I would say that with permissions, you're going to want to think about your perimeters. And for that, I want to turn to the case of the speckled band. Now, this is a story by Arthur Conan Doyle, and it features Sherlock Holmes. One of the qualities of it is that it is a locked room mystery. Basically, the door is locked, the window is locked. So how did someone die, right? How could they have been murdered if they're locked in from the inside? You know, so you have these perimeters that are known and protected, but the solution to this case involves a perimeter that was not known and not protected, and it actually involves a snake. So I think it is an excellent read for Pythonistas who are interested in thinking about the perimeters in their project and how you need to protect them and think about the permissions for those perimeters. So I give that a recommend too. All right, so to sum up, treat authentication and permissions conservatively. Don't roll your own off. Be explicit about the perimeters in your project and apply permissions carefully. All right, so the next question that we have for our detectives is, should I trust this mysterious package? All right, so we're going to turn to Sherlock Holmes for this one. And Sherlock Holmes has some wild stories about things like this. There was once a case where a client received a package containing 3 severed ears packed in salt. Oh. In another case, a client received 5 orange pips, and it turned out to be this huge threat. So a pip is a seed for fellow non-Brits. This story was one of 2 stories where the client died after seeking Holmes's help. So this mysterious package really was quite threatening and quite a problem. So no, Holmes does not believe that you should trust that mysterious package. All right. So with respect to software security, I want to give you a brief introduction into injection, user uploads, deserialization, and typo squatting. All right. So first, let's talk about handling unknowns. There is a common saying that you'll probably hear, you know, not in tech, but wherever, and it's trust but verify. And I would say no, verify and then trust. Assume anything that comes to you from outside could potentially be compromising and act accordingly. All right. So let's talk a little bit about injection and specifically SQL injection. Now, this happens when through some means, usually it's user input, something like that, a user is able to run raw SQL and they can get back information, they can delete stuff. It's potentially really troubling. And something you can do to help prevent this is to write raw SQL sparingly, if at all. It is a lot safer to use the Django ORM than to execute raw SQL queries. You can use raw SQL with Django, but raw SQL, especially raw SQL that is a string and then it's formatted using user input, it's particularly dangerous. It's just a bigger risk than using the Django ORM. So what I would say is that you should become really good friends with the Django ORM and know how to use it well. Additionally, if there are things you would like to do with the Django ORM, but it's not quite flexible enough or something like that, using a different ORM and like plugging it in to Django is a better option than writing this raw SQL. So I know I've worked on projects that have used Django and SQL Alchemy with or together, and that's a better option than raw SQL. All right, and just in general, string formatting should be done carefully. It can sometimes pose a risk of injection or code execution. All right. So let's talk about user uploads and deserialization. So when you're getting a user upload, you basically want to confirm that it is what you suspect. So if you're asking your user to upload a picture, you want to be sure that it's a picture and not, say, a script. If you're not careful with user uploads, it can leave you exposed to the risk of code execution. Now, serialized data is another way in which a threat can come in, and it's tricky because there's no way to know what the data is before you deserialize it. So if you deserialize something without being sure that you fully trust the source, you open yourself up to problems with code execution. So in this case, I don't like using serialized data for this reason, but you have to be certain about your source. Now, typo squatting. Typo squatting is another way that you could get a mysterious package from the internet, which is a little terrifying. But my question for you would be, have you ever pip installed a package without checking its name? I know I have, and it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. And that is because you could be subject to something like typo squatting. And typo squatting is when a malicious actor uploads a package and they select a name that is either like a typo of another package, or perhaps it's not a typo, but like a natural guess for that package. And if people were to download it, then, or if they were to pip install it and accidentally type the wrong thing, or you guess what the package should be called, you could be using a malicious library. So to summarize, be wary of user inputs and uploads, don't guess. How do you handle sensitive information? And this is something that all three of our detectives have encountered through their work. Now, they all understand that information is valuable and sometimes dangerous. They tend not to reveal their hunches before the appropriate time. They will explain their methods when it's appropriate, but not before. They don't always tell the authorities the full story. And they have discussed for blackmailers, because blackmailers wield personal information as weapons. We want to consider the data that we are collecting and using that comes from our users. And here I would give you the following broad advice. First, I would ask myself, do I need to collect that? Do I need to store that? And being selective in this way protects you because you can only get hacked for the data that you have. If you don't collect and you don't store something, then you can't lose it, right? So just be thoughtful. Second, I would say that this is an area where it really makes sense to delegate. There are options, both in the collection and storage of data, to outsource this to groups that are going to be very proactive about their security. And it makes sense for teams and organizations to consider when that's appropriate. Third, I would say that you want to give users tools that will help protect themselves. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier with two-factor authentication. Giving your users tools to help protect themselves can have a multiplicative effect. It's great. And then finally, just a personal point of view, something to consider is think about personal data like glitter. If I had a tube of glitter, I know that if I unscrew the cap and dump it on the table, that I am never getting all that glitter back, that glitter will end up in places that I don't expect, and that it can travel and transfer to different people, and it is not something you can undo. So to summarize, both source code and user data deserve careful consideration. You can't lose data that you don't collect. So the final question that I have is, are you up to date on your knowledge of cigar ash? And we are going to turn to Sherlock Holmes for this question. So Sherlock Holmes is constantly learning about his field. He's an experimenter. He is a knowledge sharer. He shares his findings with Scotland Yard. He is willing to do things in new ways. He's on the top of his game. And so this question really boils down to the importance of continued learning and forward progress. All right, so what does this look like for a software developer? So I would first say that security is a continual process. You are never secure and then able to check off something from a list. New vulnerabilities are found all the time. New exploits and attack vectors are executed. And, to stay security minded, it's this continual process, not only for an individual, but for a team and a company and on the industry level as a whole. To summarize that, security is never done. Good security is a product of continual learning and iteration. So this is a summary of the talk as a whole. Now, I would encourage you to generally approach your code with skepticism. And this means just asking questions and testing theories and being willing to find out that there's something you don't know about your code or that there could be a problem. It's just kind of a stance and a mindset, right? So we're going back to the security mindset. And this is part of why I like the detectives. They are curious and inquisitive, and they are trying to do something positive and make the world better. Finally, I just want to say thank you, to tell you that it's been really great to be here. I wish it could have been in person, but I'm delighted regardless. One quick thank you to Noelle Cook for drawing these excellent Python detectives for me. And Finally, a thank you to you and to all of the DjangoCon organizers who've been so flexible in this really weird year. So thanks so much for being here, and I'll be hanging around the Slack. So feel free to say hi.
I think we understood the promotion already.
Mm-hmm. Are you all enjoying DjangoCon so far?
I am.
Yeah.
It is weird, but yeah.
We would prefer to be in Porto right now, but
yeah, no, me too. So are most of you in Europe? Probably.
I'm close to Europe, Israel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
So closer in the time zone.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. So I haven't been to a Q&A session yet because I woke up just for this talk. So I'm not sure how things have proceeded earlier, but if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. I also will be watching the Slack occasionally, so feel free to shoot me something there. But yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question.
Sure.
You said there's like not a checklist that you like make sure your project is absolutely secured and so on, but like, is there a checklist to at least start off, like to see the basics?
Yeah. So what I really meant by that is that you can't, it's not like you do security once and then you're good, I guess.
Yeah.
Because the code is changing and new problems arise. But I think that it's going to depend a little on the type of project and your own personal risk tolerance. So I really hesitate to give kind of a one-size-fits-all answer to that, if that makes sense.
No, totally. I was just like wondering if there's like a source where we can search for useful tips to start like checking, well, is my Django project failing in that and that and that other basic security issues.
Right. Yeah, Django actually has pretty good documentation on security. I was impressed. So I would recommend giving a poke around their docs, just because they list some good places to start. I also, I believe I cut it for time, but I think the links are in my slides, which I tweeted out. But I had first a quick list of Python security tips and then a quick list of Django security tips. So that might be an interesting place to start because I had gone through the docs and had kind of pulled out 10 things that stuck out to me I guess. So
Yeah.
So if you want, you can find that link in the slides.
Thanks. Did you send that link somewhere? Sorry.
So earlier in the Slack, I had. Oh, you know what? I'll just drop it into the. I can drop you a link to it, but I linked to my Twitter earlier that had a link to the slides.
If you put it on with the hashtag of DjangoCon 2020, I think it will also be in the Twitter in the Slack.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I can do that.
Cool.
Well, it looks like maybe they're starting up the next. Maybe I'm wrong. Was there anything else? I'm really pleased to virtually meet you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of DjangoCon.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to go back to sleep, but I'll catch you guys later. Take care.
Good night again.